Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out on what's likely a busy Friday afternoon to join us to share your thoughts on the Food Desert Relief Tax Credit Program. This program is being created under the Economic Recovery Act, which was signed by the governor on January 7th of 2021 to create a package of tax incentive, financing, and grant programs toward the goal of building a stronger and fairer New Jersey economy. The ERA is both a broad-based recovery bill and a reform bill that will better position the state to recover from the crisis, the economic crisis caused by the pandemic, while remaining true to the EDA's commitments to transparency and accountability. To learn more about the programs created under the Economic Recovery Act, including the Food Desert Tax Credit Program, visit NJEDA.com/Economic Recovery Act. And you can also provide general feedback on the ERA there. This session is a result of an executive order number 63, signed by the governor, to provide opportunities for groups and stakeholders to engage with the EDA in the process of crafting rules around the Food Desert Relief Tax Credit Program. We welcome your constructive input on how to ensure this program and other programs created under the ERA are structured, and to ensure that they're administered in a manner that drives opportunities for all New Jersey residents and communities. We're going to begin today's session with a presentation to summarize the information, and an opportunity for your feedback will be available following the presentation. It's expected the entirety of the session will take up to 90 minutes. Anyone wishing to submit written feedback on the Food Desert Relief Tax Credit Program can do so via njeda.com/program-specific-feedback through January 9th, which is this Monday. Both the Food Desert Relief Tax Credit Program, both sessions, yesterday's and today's, are being recorded and posted on our website so that anyone unable to participate today has the opportunity to review and provide their feedback. So just a few really housekeeping items here. Feedback can be submitted verbally using the raise hand function in Zoom or writing through the Q&A feature. Input will not be accepted verbally until the conclusion of the presentation, and we ask that you use the Q&A rather than the chat feature. Each member of the public who wishes to speak during the feedback period should use the raise hand function. We'll acknowledge each speaker in the order their hand was raised, and we'll open your microphone so you can make your statements. To ensure that everyone has an opportunity to speak that wishes to, everyone will have a maximum of 3 minutes to speak and should limit their input to matters pertaining to the ERA and the Food Desert Relief Tax Credit Program specifically. Each member of the public will have one opportunity to provide remarks. If time remains at the end of the session, we'll reopen the queue for additional remarks. We ask that you not expect to engage in a dialogue. Staff may respond to basic questions or clarify points related to a speaker's input, but the staff is under no obligation to provide answers to impromptu questions or respond directly to remarks. And we ask that all speakers and members of the public just maintain proper decorum. So to access a copy of the slide presentation, it's already posted on our website, eda.com/program-specific-feedback. During the presentation, please note that any text highlighted in green indicates areas where we have exercised discretion to clarify the legislation. Non-highlighted text is written into law, and we don't have the discretion to. So again, thank you for being here today. We really appreciate your time. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our CEO, Tim Sullivan, for his perspective on the program and the issue of food insecurity.
Great, thanks, Virginia, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. It's a busy day at the conclusion of a busy week. The first week sort of back to work in the new year. So appreciate everyone taking the time and being interested in this program. My job is to be brief, given that we do have a lot of content to get through, but just to express on behalf of Governor Murphy and our entire administration and the entire EDA team how excited we are about this program. The Food Desert Relief Act is a really critical component of the Economic Recovery Act that the governor signed 2 years ago tomorrow, which has a whole suite of tools that are designed to increase New Jersey's economic competitiveness, to invest in communities, to invest in a stronger and fairer New Jersey. The Food Desert Relief Act is also a core part of the state's food security or anti-food insecurity, depending on how you see it, strategy, which is championed so strongly by folks like Craig Coughlin, Speaker Craig Coughlin in the Assembly, Mark Dinglassen, who's our food security advocate, who people think is the only food security advocate at the statewide level in the union. And so, really a part and parcel of a couple different strategies. We think this is really critical to investing in our communities, not just because it's the right thing to do to get fresh, healthy food more available to more folks in our state, but also because it has the opportunity to create jobs, create vibrancy, create the kind of fabric of a community that makes New Jersey an attractive magnet and retention vehicle for people, for companies, for families, for whoever's thinking about their future, to think about it here in New Jersey. And so we think the Food Desert Relief Act is a really potent tool. It's one of several tools. It's by no means the only strategy we have to attacking food insecurity. Even within the EDA, we've got several, but across the state, there's a number of things that are underfoot, including, most importantly, lots of funding for things like our food bank network and for things that folks like Commissioner Edelman and her team are doing at DHS around online SNAP and SNAP related pilot programs. But within the EDA, we've got a number of tools, including the Sustain and Serve program, a new program which was announced a few minutes ago called the Fridge program, which is going to help bring, as its name indicates, refrigerated storage containers to food desert communities to allow online SNAP deliveries to folks who qualify in food desert communities. And then the Food Desert Relief Act and the food desert tax credits, which we think is a really potent tool and is a lot of money to bring to the table, both to build new grocery stores, enhance existing grocery stores, and also enhance food access broadly through grants and loans and technical assistance that we'll be able to fund through the tax credit sales. So again, we're incredibly excited about this. This is a major priority for Governor Murphy. I know it's a major priority for Speaker Coughlin. I'm sure lots of others in the legislature as well. And so we're excited to bring this forward. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Emily Apple, who's the Director of Food Security, Economic Security here at the EDA, and is going to run us through all the bells and whistles of this cool program. Appreciate everyone taking the time to be here.
Thanks so much, Tim. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us on this Friday afternoon to dig in with us on the Food Desert Relief Act and the tax credit and offer your really incredible, insightful feedback that is going to help us improve and make this program great and enhance the food security of New Jerseyans. Before my colleagues dive into some of the details of the tax credit program, we wanted to give an overview of the Food Desert Relief Act, which, as Virginia mentioned at the top here, is part of the New Jersey Economic Recovery Act of 2020 that was signed into law by Governor Murphy, which is a package of multiple different types of tax incentives, financing, grant programs, of which the Food Desert Relief Act is one of them. What we're here today is to discuss the tax credit program, which exists to facilitate the development, construction, and operation of supermarkets and grocery stores within food desert communities. But beyond the tax credit program, which obviously is the focus of today, we also have a number of opportunities following this to think about other ways to support food security through, methods other than grocery stores and supermarkets, which are obviously a key part of this puzzle, but not the only solution, which includes the ability to look at what are the existing food related assets within a community and equipping them with the necessary equipment and infrastructure to be able to provide healthier food options, whether that's being able to supply a new refrigerator or freezer to your local corner store or bodega, or think about ways to enhance delivery and providing delivery trucks. Also helping it shift retailers to e-commerce, recognizing that this shift was already underway within the industry prior to COVID, but like so many other things, COVID accelerated this change, and helping retailers shift to this, particularly with a focus on SNAP and WIC recipients. And then finally, having the ability to identify and foster innovative solutions to alleviate food insecurity. There's so much great work happening across the state, and EDA is able and positioned to support that through the Food Desert Relief Act and help grow it. Next slide, please. So this is another representation of the ability we have under the Food Desert Relief Act and the tools that we have at our disposal, which take the form of tax credits, which is what we're here to dive in on today, for the financing, for the development and operation of grocery stores within food desert communities, but also grant and loan programs that are focused on technology, equipment, and broader food security initiatives, and thinking about ways to offer technical assistance to be able to enhance food security of our communities. Next slide. And as we stated, we're here to talk about the tax credits. Importantly for these programs, this is really focused on food desert communities, which is a designation that EDA worked in partnership with state agencies, in partnership with community, through public feedback sessions like this one, to come up with a really rigorous, data-driven, community-informed approach to thinking about what makes a food desert beyond just the binary presence or lack of presence of a big box grocery store. So we did, of course, look at things like the food retail environment, but also considered the demographics of these communities, the economic factors, the health factors, and the community factors. And all of these together helped us come up with a really rigorous definition, perhaps the most comprehensive definition at the state level that exists in the country, of our food desert communities. So if we go to the next slide. So this is the result of that process. And importantly, and I saw in the chat, our team has put a link to the map of food desert communities. Appearing on the list does not mean the entire municipality is included. In fact, only if you see a little asterisk next to a city is the entire municipality included in the food desert community. So it could be that there are parts of the community or parts of the municipality that are included in the broader food desert community. Food desert communities also have the ability to cross municipalities, or a single city may be broken into multiple food deserts. So I would highly recommend folks look at the maps, look at your community and sort of what pockets of communities are considered food deserts. And the map, the entire methodology, all of the data we use to underlie this analysis is available on our website. Next slide. And this is the second half of the list. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Brian Todd and Riley Edwards, who are going to really dive in on the details, and have been tremendous stewards of this process of helping figure this out, of the Food Desert Tax Credit Program. So Brian, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Riley. And thank you, Emily. I'm sorry, I'll be turning it over to Riley in a moment. As Emily mentioned, Brian Todd, I'm Senior Advisor for Food Desert Relief here at EDA, and I'm going to go over some of the details of the regulations regarding the program. And just to be clear, we're in the process of promulgating those regulations, which is what this EO63 presentation is all about. And then we will be bringing them forth to our board at a later date. And then after that, when the regulations are published, we will come out with an application process. So that's kind of where we are in the timeline of this right now. But just to go over what exactly is the Food Desert Relief Tax Program, as Emily mentioned, it was established under the ERA in 2020, working in conjunction with several other ERA programs. This portion that we're talking about today is providing tax credits to incentivize the development and operation of new supermarket and grocery stores in food desert communities. That being said, we do realize that that does not mean that every food desert community, the solution to food insecurity is a supermarket. As Emily mentioned, there are many other areas we're looking into to help on that front as well. Applications will be accepted on a rolling basis. And again, we'll be targeting those food desert communities that Emily mentioned. Our main goal is to bolster access to nutritious food, specifically for SNAP and WIC eligible New Jerseyans, but all of the food insecure. And we include many fiscal protections, and the program is funded to accept applications through 2027. Next slide, please. Some of the features, the program's capped at $240 million over 7 years. We will be able to roll over money from one year into the next for those tax credits. And there are actually two tax credits that make up the program, one for a financing gap, which awards up to 20 to 40% of project costs capped at the project financing gap. The first new supermarket in the food desert community would be eligible for up to 40%. The second would be up to 20%. Then we would also have an initial operating cost tax credit, which awards up to 50 to 100% of operating costs capped at the overall operating shortfall. And that's up to 100% of that shortfall for the first new supermarket in an FDC and up to 50% for the second. One thing to be clear, to receive both tax credits for a single supermarket, both applications must be reviewed and approved at the same time and contain matching financial information. So if it is a developer that differs from the operator, they would have to match their applications. Next slide, please. Basic definition of what we see as being a supermarket. It's a retail outlet with a lease or ownership of at least 16,000 square feet, of which 80% is occupied by food and food-related products. That would exclude alcoholic beverages and products related to the consumption of such beverages. Next slide. Again, the square footage is 16,000 square feet, and excluded from that area would be alcohol, as well as area licensed to vendors of non-food products. Next slide, please. And what we're looking at as a new supermarket or grocery store would be one that has commenced construction of the building or commenced rehabilitation of at least 75% of its square footage after the effective date of the FDRA, which was January 2021. For the first and second new supermarket or grocery store within each FDC to be approved under the program, except that a supermarket or grocery store may lose that designation of first or second if they don't meet certain milestones designated by the authority in a timely manner. So basically, that means newly or constructed supermarkets or rehabilitated after January 2021 would be eligible, and one of the first two supermarkets in an FDC to be approved under the program and on track with milestones set by NJEDA. Next slide, please. Again, this is kind of reviewing what I went over, showing it in a breakdown of everything I just said. And please, the slides are available online and can be downloaded so you can take a much deeper look at this as time goes on. Next slide, please. What are we talking about as far as rehabilitation of at least 75% of square footage is concerned? Basically, to qualify as a new supermarket, without new construction, the work done must involve repairing or replacing at least two major systems. Those could include things like heating and cooling, electrical, weatherization. The cost has to be at least 75% of the property value, and it must affect at least 75% of the square footage. Next slide, please. What does being open to the public mean? Basically, the date a new supermarket or grocery store is open they have already received temporary certificate of occupancy and all certification from state and local health departments that they are required to operate. They must meet the requirements of the awards and be open for at least 60 hours a week thereafter. Next slide, please. Operating on a full-time basis clearly means operating 60 hours a week, absent any unavoidable closures. What are those unavoidable closures? Could be things like weather, acts of God, governmental restrictions, and unavoidable casualties, as well as something out of the control of the operator that is determined at the discretion of the EDA. Next slide, please. Looking at the eligibility period for the financing tax credit is issued over 4 years, and then there's followed by a 3-year commitment period. The operating tax credit is issued over 3 years with a 4-year commitment period, meaning that an initial both tax credits start when the supermarket is open to the public, and after the tax credits end, the supermarkets must continue to meet the requirements of the program until they've been open for a total of 7 years. And next slide. And now I will turn it over to Riley Edwards, who will walk us deeply through the financing and operating tax credits.
Thank you, Brian. I will walk us through the next few sections, but in the interest of time, I won't go into too much detail. There really is a lot here, so please do look at the slides on our website and reference them, because we're going to have to move kind of fast to make sure that there's time at the end of this session for plenty of public comment from all the folks in attendance. Eligibility criteria here for the financing gap tax credit. Several of these are things that Brian already touched on. I'll highlight a couple others. One is that a feasibility study will be required, and that will have to demonstrate that the project is not economically feasible without the tax credit, but with the tax credit, it will be able to stay open for business for at least 7 years, and by the end of that period, be viable to continue operating in a sustainable way, so that this program has a lasting impact after the tax credits end. The development costs will be checked for reasonableness and against industry standards. And then down at the bottom, some other criteria here. The applicant has to commit that the supermarket will accept SNAP and WIC benefits, commit that the supermarket will devote at least 10% of retail space to fresh or frozen produce, and hold at least one community listening session annually. Next slide. Next. And one more time. Perfect. So this builds on the illustration from the previous section, just to show that within the retail space that's controlled by the operator, 10% of that has to be for fresh and frozen fruits and vegetables. Next slide, please. Great. Continuing into definitions, many of these are similar to those found in EDE's Aspire program, if folks are familiar with that. The total development cost, it's really all costs until the store opens to the public. This includes project costs as well as soft costs and the cost of acquiring land or buildings. The project area, which factors into how equity and the project financing gap are calculated, can encompass more than just the supermarket itself. There's some examples in the definition, including parking lots and loading docks. Next slide. Project financing gap. So this is the part of the total development cost that's left over after the applicant has made all good faith efforts to bring in capital, whether provided by the applicant themselves, coming from investors, loans, etc. And this is what one of the effective caps on the size of the tax credit. Next slide. Project cost. So this is a smaller umbrella than total development cost. Here in project costs, soft costs are limited to 20%, and this doesn't include land acquisition. But there are other details in these definitions that I would encourage you to reference the slides to get the full detail. Next slide. Another definition of equity. This has to be at least 20% of the total development cost. This can include a whole bunch of different things. The next slide breaks out the list of what equity can include in a simpler way. One thing to flag here, state grants or other state tax credits are not included in the calculation of equity. Next slide. The last definition we have here as reasonable and appropriate return on investment. Again, part of all of these complex calculations here. So this is the discount rate at which the present value of the future cash flows of an investment equal the cost of the investment. And when this rate is calculated, the investment that's used does not include any federal, state, or local tax credits or grants. So this is really the investment made by the applicant themselves. Okay, so moving on from definitions to how the award size is calculated. One piece of this is the labor harmony agreement. In the statute, this is only required if the state has a proprietary interest in the project. Our rules had that a labor harmony agreement remains voluntary unless the state has a proprietary interest, but developers could be eligible for a higher tax credit if they require the operator of the supermarket to have a labor. And then this slide shows how that plays out that the award size for the financing gap tax credit is the lower of either the project financing gap as calculated according to that definition, or one of these caps below based on whether the store is the first or second supermarket in a food desert community and whether or not the applicant is requiring the operator to have a labor harmony agreement. Next slide. Okay. Moving on to the application and review process. So this is not quite a comprehensive list, but some of the key things that EDA will check for in the application. A letter of support from the governing body of the municipality where the project will be located, details on the project and its financials, feasibility study, as I mentioned, a detailed floor plan, sometimes called a planogram, enough detail to determine that the store is at least 16,000 square feet, has that 80% dedicated to food and related products, and 10% of retail space for fresh and frozen produce. Specific to the financing gap tax credit, there needs to be a binding agreement between the developer and the supermarket operator at the time of application. And then, as Brian mentioned, and this is really key, if there are going to be two applications for one supermarket, one for the financing gap tax credit and one for the operating cost tax credit, those need to be submitted so that they can be reviewed and approved at the same time, and the financial figures in both applications have to be approved. Once the application is received and is complete, it goes through a few steps of review, including checking with the Department of Labor, Department of Environmental Protection, and Division of Taxation to determine that the applicant is in good standing with other state agencies, confirming that the project is aligned with industry standards, EDA's standard legal review of the applicant, analyzing the project's financials, calculating the project financing gap, etc. And finally, the application goes to the EDA board for approval. And then next slide. Once the project is approved, there are a few things that have to be provided within 1 year: documentation of site control, all required permits, and then specific to the financing gap credit, an executed agreement with the operator of the supermarket or grocery store within that 1 year, and executed financial commitments following through on what was provided in the application in terms of all the other sources of capital for the project. Next slide. Once the project is approved, reporting requirements kick in. There's progress reports every 6 months and more detailed annual reports. The goal of these is really to show the project continues to be in compliance with all of the requirements that we laid out so far. Next slide. And then when the development of the supermarket is finished, there's various documentation required to certify that the supermarket is open to the public and the development is completed, again, to demonstrate that the requirements are met. So this is a list of some of those key pieces. Okay, next slide. So after the supermarket opens, there are a couple of points where the sort of stop and check and rerun the numbers. And the first of those happens at the end of the 3rd year of the eligibility period. So the store has been open for 3 years and 3 tax credits have been issued. And there's a sort of a new analysis of the actual rate of return, and that's compared to the rate of return that was approved by the board based on the estimates provided in the application. And if the actual return on investment is more than 15% more than what was approved by the board, 20% of the excess is then subtracted from the next year's tax credit. So the 4th year's award could then be smaller if the project is basically more successful than expected by quite a bit. Next step, or next slide. Anytime during the 7 years, the first 7 years after the store is open, if the applicant sells or leases the store, again, there will be sort of a recheck of that rate of return. And if it exceeds what was determined at board approval, then the applicant will be required to pay up to 20% of that excess back to EDA, or sorry, back to the state general fund. Okay, that wraps up the financing gap tax credit. So I will go through similar information on the operating cost tax credit, and much of it really mirrors that first program. Eligibility criteria are largely the same. In this case, the applicant is the entity that operates the supermarket, and that may be the same entity that's doing the development, but in some cases it may be a different entity. Next slide. In the definitions, we've defined initial operating costs to be within the first 3 years after opening to the public, as well as within 1 month prior to opening. The operating costs have to be aligned with industry standards, and cost of goods or inventory is not included in initial operating costs. But initial operating costs can include things like payroll, rent, utilities, insurance, and so forth. Next slide. Initial operating cost shortfall. So a simple equation for calculating this would be initial operating costs as defined on the previous slide, plus net operating profit minus net income. And net operating profit is after taxes other than income taxes, and would be calculated as a percentage of sales. And net income is after cost of goods. And that net operating profit would be based on industry standards. So we've constructed an example here with some formulas and some numbers so folks can see how this plays out. I won't walk you through the math during this presentation, but please refer to the slides and follow the steps and see how it all flows and comes together. So can we go on to the next slide? And one more. All right, so this slide describes how the award size is determined. It's capped at whichever is lower, the initial operating cost shortfall or these caps that Brian mentioned earlier. For the first supermarket, 100% of initial operating costs, or for the second supermarket in a food desert community, 50% of initial operating costs. However, for a supermarket to meet the feasibility requirement that's part of eligibility, we would expect to see shortfalls that are well below that 100% or 50% of operating costs. So the cap here that's likely to be relevant more often is that initial operating cost shortfall. Next slide. Again, the application and review process is very similar to the financing gap credit. One small difference here for the operating credit: if the applicant will have a landlord, we would require an acknowledgement from the landlord that the applicant will be operating the supermarket in the space. And again, both applications need to be reviewed and approved together if they're going to be financing gap and operating cost tax credit applications for the same supermarket. Next slide. Again, we have the same set of checks with DOL, DEP, taxation, checking against industry standards, and for reasonableness, EDA's legal review, financial analysis, and then optimal. Next slide. These requirements within 1 year of approval are very similar here. One that's unique to the operating cost tax credit at the bottom is evidence of sufficient liquidity or financing to operate the supermarket, just to ensure that the project is really feasible and ready to move forward. Again, similar requirements around progress reports and annual reports to document continued compliance. And next slide, and I think it's time for me to hand it back over to Brian to go over some more overarching requirements. Thank you.
Thank you, Riley. Yeah, very detailed presentation. Yeah, I'm just going to go over some additional requirements. Next slide. Sure. As far as compliance is concerned, a material misrepresentation of facts in the application or incentive award may result in the rescission or recapture of the tax credits. Potential consequences include a delay in receiving the tax credit, or a partial or full forfeiture, or a full or partial recapture. What may trigger those could be disqualification as a SNAP or WIC vendor, if the project is no longer a supermarket, of course, if it's not operating on a full-time basis as designated, if they don't dedicate 10% of their retail space to fresh or frozen produce, or if they do not hold the annual community sessions that Riley referred to. Next slide. And there are a few additional scenarios. If they fail to submit their annual report in a timely fashion, if they're not in good standing with any of the agencies that Riley alluded to earlier, failure to satisfy any labor harmony agreement if it's applicable, if they don't meet any prevailing wage requirements, again, a misrepresentation of fact, or a failure to comply with the requirements that each contractor or subcontractor is a public works registered contractor and has not been debarred by DOL and they possess an active tax clearance from the taxation department. Next slide, please. If based on new information, the authority finds that the recapture should have been applicable, the authority shall recapture the tax credits. If all or part of the tax credit sold or assigned is subject to recapture, then the authority shall pursue recapture from the applicant. So basically, if the tax credit is sold, the buyer will be held harmless upon recapture. Next slide, please. Regarding the cannabis prohibitions, so basically anyone who is issued, has or is issued a cannabis license is not eligible for the program, and a project that is or will be used for cannabis related purposes or to benefit from a cannabis business is not eligible for the program. Next slide. This goes into much detail about the fees, again, because there's a financing tax credit and an initial operating cost tax credit. There's two levels, so we're looking at a project cost below and above $10 million for the financing tax credit, and for the operating tax credit, sales of less than 20 million or over 20 million. There are many different levels here that will be in much more detail in the regulations once they are finalized. Next slide, please. And there are additional slides available at the end of the presentation that might give you a little more detail. So again, if you have not already, please download the slides and look at them at your leisure. And hopefully, if you have any questions, you can send them in by January 9th. And next slide. And I will turn it back over to Virginia as we will kind of open the floor for questions.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. So just to revisit the public feedback policy, we just ask if you have any questions or comments that you submit them verbally by using the raise hand function in Zoom or in writing through the Q&A feature. Each member of the public who wishes to speak during the feedback period should use the raise hand feature. Each speaker will be acknowledged in the order in which their hand was raised, and your microphone will be open so you can make your remarks. To ensure that everyone that chooses to do so has an opportunity to speak, each speaker will have a maximum of 3 minutes to speak and should limit input to matters pertaining to the ERA of 2020 and the New Jersey Food Desert Relief Tax Credit Program. Each member of the public will have one opportunity to provide remarks. If time remains at the end of the session, we'll reopen the opportunity for additional comments. And we ask that you not expect to engage in a dialogue. Staff may respond to basic questions or clarify some points, but staff is not obligated to answer questions on an impromptu basis or respond to remarks. And with that, it appears as though we don't have any hands raised at the moment, so let's just give everyone a moment to sort of gather their thoughts. I know throughout the presentation, our team has been putting the link to the slides and to the public comment page in the chat feature, so you have until through Monday to make your remarks. So it doesn't appear as though we have any raised hands. I'm just checking the Q&A to see if any questions have come in. We do have one question. Can the market be in a mixed use space with other food related businesses like restaurants and eateries? Does anyone from the team want to answer that question?
I mean, I can address that. Yes, as far as if it's a supermarket with other food related areas, then they could be included in the program. Of course, if it's a large mixed use development and there's a supermarket as part of that, the supermarket would be kind of carved out from that total space, but it does not have to be a totally freestanding supermarket.
Okay, that's good to know, Brian. Thank you. We have another question. When do you anticipate finishing the proposed regulations, and will it be distributed to the stakeholder groups? Can someone speak to the process of, getting the regs finalized and approved? Brian, do you have any thoughts
Sure.
on that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I couldn't get myself off mute there.
Okay.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we're in the process. The regulations still have to go to, once finalized at our end, go to the board for approval. So sometime after that, then we will, they will be made public, and certainly we can, please check back to our website to see when that happens. And we will make them available to anyone who would like them.
Terrific. Thanks, Brian. And a couple more questions. Is there any requirement for workforce rights or labor to organize if not unionized? What kinds of financial and additional incentives might cities be expected to offer to attract developers and operators? I'm not sure we can speak to that, but maybe perhaps someone could comment on the workforce rights issues.
Yeah, I was typing an answer to that, so I'm happy to just give it out loud. Our statute does include a definition of a labor harmony agreement. I can put the link to the ERA text in answer to that Q&A. It's quite a lengthy definition, but basically requires that the employer not stand in the way of unionization and that the union not do any strikes or walkouts or other disruptive activity. And our proposed draft rules would set not a requirement for a labor harmony agreement, but if a developer did require the operator of the supermarket to have a labor harmony agreement, that developer could be eligible for a higher cap on their tax credit. And then, as Virginia alluded to, the Food Desert Relief Act doesn't speak to any requirements for cities. So this is really just about a state level tax credit.
Great, thanks, Riley. A couple more questions have come in. Are there any tax credit relief incentives for currently open markets located in the designated food deserts that are looking to remodel or renovate, or is this only for new development?
It is for new supermarkets, but also for redeveloped if 75% or more is redeveloped, which is, there's more details in the slide as well as will be in the regulations.
Okay,
terrific. And I'm sorry, can we please, can you just pause for a second, Virginia, please? Sure. I also think it's important, and Riley, maybe you can restate it, or Brian, the clarification about the timeline about what a new supermarket means, and the connection from the signing of the Food Desert Relief Act, which was part of the Economic Recovery Act on January 7th, 2021. That's an important nuance that I think we should clarify with that question.
Sure, I can, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, right, it would be if something occurred after the signing of the act back in January of 2021. So if anything happened before then, obviously would not be eligible in any way.
And just to add on that, for a store to be the first or second new supermarket, not necessarily the first or second to be constructed after that January 2021 date, but the first or second to be approved under this program. Distinction.
Okay, terrific. Thank you for the clarification. Another question, will applicants receive funding via state credits or direct funding?
It's a tax credit program on the corporate business tax.
Thanks for the clarification on that. I don't see anything, any raised hands, but we do have a question on how hard and fast the geographical boundaries are, recognizing that a lot of work went into the study and designations. In some cases, the boundaries would exclude sites that are within a few blocks of the designated tracts. Would a site in close proximity but outside of the designated food desert be considered for eligibility?
Yeah, no, it would have to be within the food desert community. And if anyone would like to look at the map that's on the website, which I know the links were put up, but it's very clear what those boundaries are.
Thanks, Brian. And we have another question. Will the proposed tax credit foster small to medium markets in the food desert communities owned by small business owners? I think this is sort of around size of the markets.
Well, yeah, because again, the size that we're working at is 16,000 square feet. So that could be, anyone operating a supermarket. It's certainly open to businesses of all sizes as long as they follow the the requirements of the program.
And if I may just add to that, Brian, while the tax credit program is limited to supermarkets of 16,000 square feet or more, again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, after the passage of these regulations, we will have greater flexibility through grant, loan, and technical assistance programs to assist retailers of all sizes, not just those that are 16,000 square feet or greater. So while the statute limits us on the tax credit side to supporting only retailers of that size or greater, it doesn't speak to who the ownership is. So certainly the ownership, could come from a variety of different sources, but in terms of the size of the retailer, we have much greater flexibility through the other programs that will be established under the Food and Desert Relief Act, apart from the tax credit program to support smaller retailers.
Thanks, Emily. Tara, did you want to jump in on the clarification of the one question?
Sure. So there was a question about the eligibility, I think, of a first or second supermarket. This is referenced in the slide deck. If you download it, it's slide 18 that says the first or second new supermarket or grocery store within each community. So in order to receive tax credits, a supermarket must be newly constructed or rehabilitated after January 2021. And it must be one of the first two supermarkets in a food desert community to be approved by NJEDA under this program.
Thanks, Tara. Then one additional question, is there a program provision for farmers or farmers markets or a provision for food wholesalers? Or is this strictly retail?
I think as Emily mentioned, this portion of the tax credit program is simply for supermarkets and grocery stores. But as we move forward and have more options to work with down the road, we will be able to sell tax credits to come up with additional programs to help food insecurity on many different levels.
Thanks, Brian. So I believe that's the end of our questions, unless anybody has anything else they'd like, or comments that they'd like to pose at this point. If not, I'd just like to say thanks again to everyone for attending on a busy Friday. Your input is so important. And thanks also to our presenters for being so thorough and responsive.